3.
Hi, I'm Lauren Young. I'm coming to you live from my dining room in New York City. I am the workplace editor at Reuters, and I'm so excited you're joining us today for a discussion on the power of the multi-generational workforce. Before we start today's panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Joanne Jenkins, who is the CEO of AARP, who's going to give some welcoming remarks. Joanne, take it away.
Welcome to this webinar. I'm Joanne Jenkins, CEO of AARP. We're excited to join with Reuters to co-sponsor this important live discussion today on the future of work, and it comes at a very significant time. The COVID-19 global pandemic has forced us into a grand experiment on the future of work, pushing practices on telework and flexible work forward with unexpected urgency. At the same time, as people live longer and generally healthier lives, they're working longer, giving both employers and employees of all ages the opportunity to reimagine what it means to earn and learn over a lifetime. At AARP, we see these converging trends of automation and aging as a win-win for business and older workers. Older workers bring important, uniquely human skills that can't be automated, and age-diverse workforces are better at creating problem solving. Our recent global employer survey of roughly 6,000 employees across 36 OECD nations found that 83% of global executives recognize that a multi-generational workforce is key to business growth and success. They see it as a competitive advantage. Multi-generational teams perform better. They also help build a stronger pipeline of talent by providing continuity, stability, and retention of intellectual capital. A multi-generational workforce benefits the global economy as well. According to OECD calculations, giving older workers the best opportunity to work could raise GDP per person across our OECD by 19% over the next 30 years. There is also evidence that greater diversity supports higher innovation revenue and profit margins. Yet, 53% of global executives we surveyed do not include age in a diversity and inclusion policy. So it's clear there is much more work to be done to embrace an age-diverse workforce. At AARP, we're working with international institutions, including the World Economic Forum, OECD, and the United Nations to identify best practices and economic incentives for building, supporting, and sustaining a multi-generational workforce in this age of increased longevity. In 2019, we joined with the World Economic Forum and OECD to establish a learning collaborative called Living, Learning, and Earning Longer to identify and share workforce practices. Through regional discussions, research, and conversations with executives at companies around the world, we are identifying standards, policies, and practices that reflect an age-diverse and inclusive workforce. We will release our conclusions at the World Economic Forum next year in a digital learning platform that will help all interested executives build their organization's capacity and get the most out of a multi-generational workforce. This webinar will provide further insights as to how work is being reimagined around the globe, highlighting the ramifications for people of all ages, companies, and society. So now, let me turn things over to Lauren Young, Special Projects Editor at Reuters, who will lead our discussion.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And now I just want to get right to our panel. And to do that, I want to introduce our guests. Special guest star, we have Emily Graham, who is from Fleischman Hillard. Emily, I believe you're the first chief of diversity and inclusion at Fleischman Hillard, and you're also one of the youngest partners ever at your PR firm. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Great. I also want to introduce, I don't know if you know this, but we have a very special guest star. Unfortunately, Jana Torson from Pitney Bowes lost power in yesterday's crazy storm and literally cannot get out of her house because there are trees down everywhere. Thankfully, her wonderful and esteemed colleague, Cheryl Battles, who is the VP of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Engagement at Pitney Bowes, literally just stepped in the last hour to join us. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for being the pinch hitter today.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for having me.
And then finally, my friend who I've known for a long time, Dan Schwabel. Dan, you're an author, you're a workplace expert, and you are my guru. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's just get started. Emily, I'm going to let you kick it off. Can you talk a little bit about Fleischman, about your millennial cohort and the people you work with, and the age diversity that you see in your firm, along with some of the other factors at play right now?
Yeah, Lauren, thanks for having me and looking forward to the discussion. Fleischman Hillard, for those who aren't familiar, is a global communications firm. We are about 75 years old. We advise for communication strategy some of the biggest clients in the world in the Fortune 10, 200. We also advise the private and public sector. And we have about 2,300 employees across about 80 offices in 30 countries. And we have a majority millennial workforce, which is reflective of the public relations industry, if you're familiar with it. We also have a large number of Gen X's, and we still have a good consort of boomers too. So we are mostly millennial, and millennials, as you know, have a very wide range, all the way into the late 30s of 38 or 39, all the way down to about 25 or 24, which means they're in very different life stages. And so we have to reflect that not only in our culture, but in our work life situation that we're experiencing right now with COVID, but also with kind of the emotional intelligence, with everything that's happening with racial injustice around the world. Everyone has a different view and lens on it. Our role is a bit unique because we're advising clients on their issues outside in and providing that consultative view. But in this regard, we kind of become our own client, because when you look at 5 generations under one roof or one screen is really what our reality is. And my role now as a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer and a millennial, I see things in a much different way. I hear messages in a different way. And I know that we have a lot of kind of journey ahead of us as we look to resonate with multiple generations in a really dynamic and complex time, Lauren. So that's a lot about Fleischman Hillard.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Cheryl, will you tell us a little bit about Pitney Bowes, a company that's been around for 100 years, I believe?
That's correct. As I was sharing with you, Lauren, and Emily and Dan earlier, I think we represent the diversity from a generational perspective as an organization at 100. We turned 100 on April 23rd.
Happy birthday.
You really, thank you. You don't really get to be 100 without the ability to reimagine the way you contribute value and reinvent the way you deliver it. And that's really what Pitney Bowes has done throughout its 100 years, and that we help our clients do in terms of applying technology to really enable people to connect with their clients, both via mail and shipping. So we have about 11,000 employees worldwide. And in our SynTech portfolio, for example, we service over 750,000 small business clients and 90% of the Fortune 500. So we have this great range of clients, if you will.
And remind me, a fair number of employees too. Remind me how many it is?
We have about 11,000 employees. And then on the commerce services side, we help consumers in 220 countries shop from some of their favorite retailers, brands, and marketplaces, such as doing e-commerce fulfillment, delivering returns for both retailers and clients like eBay, and process over 150 million packages annually, and then another 400 million enabled by our digital technology. So needless to say,
I was going to say, Cheryl, some of those packages have been coming to my house.
I was going to say, needless to say, we've been at peak volumes this entire year with COVID. And so it's been certainly a time in which we've had both essential workers who have had to remain on site, as well as office workers who have been at home. When you look at who we are as a people, while we certainly have much more to go, everyone has much more to go, as the tragic events of the killing of George Floyd highlighted. We are proud of our progress relative to diversity. About 50% of our board of directors are women, and half of all of our committees are headed by women. Our workforce is 43% women globally, and 49% people of color in the US. From a generational perspective, we are about 43% millennial and younger. And then the balance of the workforce is evenly split between Gen X and boomers. So we really do believe in an all generational workforce. We need the talents and skills of everyone to help us deliver value. And that's what we are working towards.
And not to put you in a box, Cheryl, but you do represent the boomer cohort, right?
I was certainly a child prodigy, but yes, I am a boomer. Proud of it.
Even though my last name is Young, I am Gen X, so I'm not Gen Z. Dan, also another millennial. I would love for you just to kick off the conversation talking a little bit about the challenges of a multi-generational workforce. You've written about this for as long as I've known you, but obviously there are new challenges in the era of COVID-19.
Well, the first thing that I find really interesting, based on a study by Pew Research a few years back, is that in terms of generations who associate with their moniker, the younger you go, the less likely that individuals in those generations want to be associated with millennial, boomer, et cetera. So if you talk to boomers and call out, hey, you're a boomer, they're more accepting of that than a millennial. They don't want to be called millennials. So I find that to be interesting. And in terms of managing the different generations, I think people want to be treated as individuals now. And the younger you go, the more people want custom attention from both a consumer perspective and a workplace perspective. So the workplace is becoming more individualized. The other thing that I find interesting is there is a digital divide, especially once you compare, the greatest generation, silent generation versus millennials or Gen Z. And I think what's happening now during these times of COVID is that because everyone has to use the same platforms, I think that's bringing everyone together in unique ways. And since we're like 5 months into this, I think people have already adjusted. And so, I remember the early research is like, the generations are like, this technology is millennializing them, meaning that millennials and Gen Z who are on all these different social networks, now you have the older generations that are on the networks in order to connect with, their daughter, their son, people they work with. And so I think that technology is the great equalizer in this way. And while there was a hurdle and more of a digital divide early on, March and April, I think now we've reached a point where the technology is actually fusing the generations together, enabling them to collaborate in a very positive way. I think one of the big things that I find fascinating, and just talking with a lot of CEOs, a lot of heads of HR, is who wants to work in a physical space, especially in a city. And it turns out that whilst a lot of things have changed, a lot of things have remained the same. So young people who are recent college graduates want to work in a city in a physical office space. So what you're seeing, which is counterintuitive of what I was thinking of, this hybrid model and a lot more people working remote, is young people want to work in physical office space in a city, and therefore companies that need to prioritize safety is the new differentiator for winning the war for talent now, is they're investing in larger commercial spaces to take into account social distancing.
Yeah, before I get to my next question, I do want to say that if you're watching this right now, you can submit a question on our On24 platform. So please submit a question for our experts, for me, for the universe, and I will get to them in the last 10, 15 minutes of this panel discussion. Submit your questions now. Emily, I want to ask you specifically, how has your work changed, and how are you collaborating and connecting with your colleagues? Because the thing I find really challenging, and what I miss the most about the office, is all of the little interactions, the water cooler chit chat, if you will. And that was, you would literally be part of people's lives, of their parents passing away, of their kids being born, of weddings. And that's all part of the fabric of a multi-generational workforce. And it is not happening on Zoom for me. I don't know if it's happening for you.
Yeah, I think our work is one where we are speaking all day. Literally, because we are communications consultants, we're writing or talking with clients most of the day. Most communicators like to talk a lot. And so I think that it has helped us communicate with one another more directly and maybe in even a more intentional way. I do think that we are perhaps overusing technology at this point. I do not think it's healthy for anyone to be on Zoom calls, video calls for 12 hours or 10 hours a day. I think it's taxing emotionally and mentally. That's what I'm finding. But I think in terms of our work, it has made us more high touch. We are communicating and having to consult on some pretty traumatic and crisis related issues right now. We started in March with COVID-19. Every company, no matter what their market cap size or geography, was trying to figure out how are they going to protect their business, their license to operate, show up as a good employer, like Dan said. Because everybody wanted to know, how are you caring for the people? If you are not demonstrating proper care of your customer or your employees, then that's going to take your reputation down considerably, right? But then in May, we pivoted very quickly to now we are having to also advise on COVID, but then we were advising on, are you a racist or anti-racist organization? What do you stand for? What does bias mean? What is your position on equality and inclusion? So we, I think our work has gotten us to become more intimately close because we're talking about some really real things. We're not just talking about issuing a press release or a brand positioning. We're talking about where do you stand societally as a change agent. And so I think that part has been good. I think when it comes down to the connections that you make with people, I think that because the platform has become video, and that's the expectation that you show up looking camera ready, even if there's a party downstairs and you're upstairs, you're professional. I do think you don't really want to talk anymore, right? Like sometimes you would get up and go to the kitchen in the office place because you wanted that break between calls. There's not really that break between calls right now. You have to go to the next call. So when do you really want to small talk about your kid's birthday or about what your dog did? I have taken pleasure in acknowledging the awkward moments on calls when I see like a child run by or when I hear somebody's husband yell in the background, and we just acknowledge it. I think we've had to get more comfortable with stop trying to be on all the time and make these moments more personal and lasting. I think some of our younger employees, I think there's two things that are happening. I'm starting to appreciate and understand introverts more than I ever did before. In an office environment, I don't think introverts and extroverts and even those in between was clear to me as much as it is now, but the energy required to engage with people all day, I do think can be diminishing for some of our employees. And when we talk about inclusion, it's not just about geography. It's also, or generation, it's also about personality. It's also about mental space. And so that is something that I'm taking away and giving those who need the space that time to kind of step back and not requiring them to go to all the virtual happy hours or mandatory fun. But maybe we do one-on-one calls or little 3 or 4 people groups so we can actually catch up and talk and do things in that way where we can actually have some meaningful engagement. So that's a long answer, Lauren, but I hope I answered your question.
Oh, you went a lot of places. I literally. Yeah. But I'm curious what you said because I saw you nodding your head, Dan. Like, is this the age of the introvert? I know that you've got some. Dan and I actually, in preparing for this, he's got some really interesting thoughts about what it means to work remotely and how you can be perceived as a stellar worker versus the FaceTime in the office. So Dan, I'll let you talk a little bit about that.
I work remote for over 10 years now from home, and so this was pretty normal for me, but a fourth of the people who in March started working from home did it for the first time ever. Wow. And so you're going to get a percentage that like it, you're going to get a percentage that, miss going to a physical office. So it's pretty diverse. And in fact, one of my big conclusions over the past 5 months is that everyone has a unique experience, everyone, because there's so many variables, much like diversity. How old are you? What generation are you part of? What's your gender? What's your ethnic background? How were you raised? There's just so many permutations. And then you add on, are you pregnant? Have you had COVID? Are you married? are you living alone? Because if you're living alone, then you might be lonely and isolated too. And that's something that I've studied as well in this moment. So I think for introverts, of course, this has been a huge plus because this is what they wanted beforehand. I remember when I was working for a Fortune 200 company, I wanted to work remote. I had the first social media position at the company, Fortune 200, and they wouldn't let me work remote because they said, "Oh, other people will be jealous of you." And then now look where we are. So really, what we're talking about is COVID-19 was the gasoline that was poured on all the workplace trends and needs of the workers that we've been talking about for like a decade. So flexibility, that's always been important. I led 2 different studies with Randstad from 2014 to 2016. In 2014, the top employee benefits that people wanted, it was like healthcare, and then flexibility, I believe, and then learning and development. And then that switched in 2016, and flexibility was number 1 for Gen Zs and millennials globally. So I think flexibility it's part of the core. That's what people are looking for. In fact, if you're applying for a job, you're looking for flexibility. And most jobs now that are posted that are not essential are remote work positions. And what makes this really fascinating is that for the first time ever, when let's say Google or Pitney Bowes or someone who you'd have to relocate for that job, you don't have to relocate for it anymore.
It democratizes it, right?
Let me jump in here because I have so much I want to say on this topic. And I actually co-lead our global return to office strategy. So I've always said that, the future is here. It's just unevenly distributed. And what COVID-19 did was accelerate the distribution of that future. So at Pitney Bowes, we had over 45% of our workforce that was already working flexibly prior to COVID-19. So they were either at home or they were doing a combination of working where it worked for them between both the home and in Pitney Bowes designated facilities. But as Dan said, while we are all experiencing this at the same time, it is all impacting each of us differently. So when we talk about our core principles that are guiding our strategy for returning to the office, we talk about it being a very human-centric approach, guided by flexibility, adaptability, and empathy. Because we all can. Emily talked about being able to really relate to introverts. I think we've had colleagues say, wow, I can really relate to when we talk about geographical diversity, I can relate to my colleagues in another time zone. Because now I know what it feels like to, when meeting times get shifted or when we need to flex and accommodate. So empathy is a huge thing relative to effectively returning to the office. Popular cooking shows talk about deconstructing food. Well, what people have been doing since COVID-19 is deconstructing the work experience. And as you think about it from a spatial perspective, from an operational perspective, and from a relationship perspective, as you rethink those elements and you say, well, what will that look like? We know that for us, the office will always have an important place. It's what has helped us fundamentally build who we are and the culture that we have. But but we are reimagining it relative to what has to get done there versus what doesn't. And as I said, since flexibility was already such a big part of our lives, we know we're going to maintain that flexibility. In our annual engagement studies, the top 3 reasons of why people stay with us is flexibility. So it's long been a competitive advantage for us in being able to offer that kind of flexibility to our diverse workforce.
Culture is so important to a company like Pitney Bowes that's been around for 100 years, a company like Fleischman Hillard that's been around for 60 plus years, I believe.
75, yeah.
Thomson Reuters were, 165 years plus. We have a culture. And what I'm curious about is how do you impart that culture in a remote world,
Hmm.
particularly across generations, because I know that you've been at your company, Cheryl, for 30 years. I'm not going to call you an old timer, but you're somebody you've got an institutional knowledge.
I'm
And
like fine wine, Lauren.
We
Well
call you a
seasoned and
lifer.
delicious.
She's a lifer. You're a lifer, Cheryl.
Right. Certainly doing some of the things.
Go ahead. I was going to say your interns, like, how do they understand what Pitney Bowes is about?
Well, I think there's going to be a whole generation or a whole cohort that gets onboarded digitally. So they've never been onboarded face to face. But for instance, for people that we have hired, it sounds like a little thing, but the manager sends out an email to the entire team and broader the partner networks that they're going to be working with. To say, hey, welcome, this person is here. Everybody sends them a note back, and then we set up meetings with them so that we can have a real-time conversation, whether it's over Teams or Zooms or whatever video platform it is, but we're building connections that way. We've set up something called the virtual or the remote worker hub. It's a virtual water cooler. So you can drop by and hang out and see what people are doing and find out about things. So this concept of being able to extend a culture, across geography, across time zones, across generations, is one that we have been working on, but it takes intentionality. So that we have found when surveying, and we do a lot of surveying related to our return to office, as well as with our high engaging population. And we found that what they are doing is communicating as much or more than they were before, with the one-to-ones, with some of that enforced quote, I think as Emily called it, enforced fun. It actually does break things up for people. So we have, for instance, our global HR team just did one of those video sing-alongs to Lean On Me. And it's been a huge hit. And, people wrote in saying, oh, this is great. This made my day, et cetera. So being able to and feeling free to kind of reach out and connect and do it consistently and intentionally. One small thing we do is either begin or end every meeting with personal time. So you don't jump right into the agenda. It starts with how you doing.
Well, we
And
should
then people will do that.
Yeah. We should have done that with the panel discussion.
So it makes a difference. This is definitely one of those periods in, I think, all of our lives where how are you has gone from just this kind of standard greeting to people are much more apt to tell you, and you are listening much more intently for the answer.
And I'm to you intently before I get to you, Emily. Just want to remind people, if you have a question, ask it in the question box. Emily, you were going to say something?
How do you get to keep your culture or grow your culture right now? Transparently, we're in the middle of a cultural chasm. Our culture has shifted. I mean, if any company in America and the world is not looked at their culture as a result of May 25th, then you're not really thinking about what culture means, because your people make up your culture. The way they feel and belong make up the culture. And I think Cheryl made a very good point when you ask people, how are you? Be prepared for what they say or don't say. I think for us, there is a history and legacy of a company of our age and the others on the call that we're super proud of. So on the one hand, you have that as people can stand on and learn your history, learn what you've done, learn your positioning. And for Fleischmann-Hillard, we're a Midwestern-based company. We are based in St. Louis, the only company in the big four, if you will, of PR firms that's based in the Midwest and not a shiny, big coastal city. And that is very consistent with our culture. Everyone's very polite and kind and kind of humble in the way we approach just how we work with one another. Everyone kind of works very hard and then wants to build relationships. But sometimes we don't have a moment to kind of stop and really say, how are you doing? And this has forced us to really pivot and say, you know what? What are people thinking within our walls? How are our employees doing? We have new employees coming on every day, but culture is also the people who have been there for 20, 15, 5 years. And we want to make sure that the experience for them resonates. And what I will say is we've become far more intimate and raw. We've become far more comfortable with being uncomfortable. We've become far more intentional about how we ask and respond to how are you. And I think that is a cultural change that we didn't have 8 weeks ago. And Lauren, when I spoke to you last year, I wasn't in this job. I wasn't the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. I was running our financial services practice in the Americas. And from that vantage point, dealing with the financial services industry, seeing how they had to navigate reputational uplift after the financial crisis. I would say every company in the world is in a crisis of reputation right now, because now it's not only about how you responded to COVID, it's how are you standing up? And how do your employees of color, your Black, your Latinx, your others see your culture? And I will tell you from advising some clients from the seat of the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer, there are some disconnects between what companies think their culture and their legacy has been in this space and what they really are. And I think that is a conflict that a lot of companies have had to resolve and say, you know what, we have done well, but we could do better. And not only could we do better, like everyone could, we missed some things. That's different than saying we can do better. And so for us, we've spent the past several weeks reconciling what we should have done and what we want to do. And we're asking our employees to come along with us on the journey. And now we have activists. I mean, our employees are the ones who are out also protesting, and some of them chose not to, and that's fine. But we're recognizing this beautiful menagerie of people that are on all sides of the political spectrum, all sides of the lifestyle spectrum, saying, I want to be proud of the company I work for. That means we have to check the culture. And it's really been an eye-opening experience. It's been something that I hope when we speak again in 6 months, I'm going to tell you and show up in a whole new Fleischman-Hillard. We're in a metamorphosis right now, and it's really been good for us. Really good.
I love the metamorphosis image. Mm-hmm. I wish that I could do video in the background.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know one of the things that you've been thinking a lot too is in the era of remote work, like I've been working from home since my son was born. He's 15. So it's for me also like not every day, one day. Yeah. So I was used to it a little bit. And I think my managers trusted me. They knew that I was present. Yeah. But I'm curious, Dan, for you, like what's the perception now? Are people who are working remotely, are they perceived as doing a good job? And, will we be able to do this, going forward when someday when this is all over?
Yeah, I just led a global study with Kronos, and we found that people who work remote are less trusted than people in a physical space. But I've also found, and the thing that has gone completely against what I had always thought from different polls that I've done, is that people would rather promote a remote worker over an office worker. And I follow up and I said, why? Why is that true? Because I always thought, well, you want to be seen and heard by senior management. And if they see you're doing work, especially if like older generations, that's definitely something that they were looking for. If you look at the data, you'd be able to get a promotion over a remote worker who's not really seen, aside from video. And it's actually, people want to promote remote workers because they're self-directed.
That's really interesting. Cheryl, what do you think about that?
I do find that fascinating. Certainly in our internal research, we have found engagement very high. We've had employee self-assessment of their productivity, and where they reported being at the same level or greater productivity, and the same thing in terms of connectivity with each other. and their teams as well as their management. So we, again, our population seems to overall have adjusted quite a bit. But to points that both Dan and Emily have made previously, certainly, it's not unusual to sit down in front of your screen of choice at 8 a.m. and still be sitting there at 8 p.m. Right? Everyone is really, I think, dealing with this incredible flurry of information and opportunities to connect coming their way. And so one of the things that we actually have always had a emphasis on wellness, if you will. But one of the things at the beginning of this, back in March, I did an executive summary about what I thought were going to be the diversity, inclusion, and engagement implications of COVID-19. And one of them was really around mental wellness and resilience. So we have an initiative really designed to support that resilience, that capacity to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty over this extended period of time while trying to remain focused and healthy. And it really is about mental, physical, and financial wellness. So we've got, we've done everything from online classes conducted by our own staff around exercise, but also stress reduction and meditation. We have something called the Serenity Hour, right, where anyone can tune in and again just talk, just talk and share best practices. We do a whole series of tips on kind of how to manage time and break up the day, et cetera, to really get people to be very cognizant of the need, not just for the physical health and well-being, but the mental breaks, and just, have been communicating about the need to take vacation. Even though we realize for most it will be a staycation, you still need some time where, I don't have, start my meetings at X amount of time where I can just be and actually go sit outside and read a book,
Yes.
So we have been trying to focus on really helping and supporting our employees on this journey in a fairly holistic manner. And we've got more things coming. To Emily's earlier point, I think it's this combination of the times we're in, both I've been calling them the dual pandemics, right? The pandemic from the virus and the pandemic of this awareness of racial justice and what does it really mean. And I think the two things have really caused an opening for sci-fi lovers. A portal has opened and it gives us this opportunity exactly to have conversations that you probably weren't having a year ago. And so around after the events related to the tragedy of George Floyd, certainly we initiated a series of things, including the CEO and I having a one-on-one broadcast globally talking about race, totally unscripted. And from that, we've had, all of these dialogues happen, and we're providing some support on that. We're doing a webinar on allyship. But we are getting everyone talking about it. I moderated a panel at our board of directors meeting, been in front with the senior team for a 2-hour discussion on what happens next. Just this real focus and this real openness to really talking about things that matter, and moving forward constructively, because we all know that it takes the best of all of us and each of us to deliver the best for our clients.
And one quick thing to that, just to kind of go back to what we were saying about productivity, the national polls, even pre-COVID, said that remote workers are more productive, but it comes at a cost. A lot of the things we're talking about seem great. The virtual onboarding experience, it's more seamless with the use of technology, but it comes at the cost of not getting as acquainted to the people you work with, and onboarding is so important. But the other cost to all this productivity is people are working up to 10 hours more per week, and that factors in to the burnout crisis and mental health problems. And there's over hundreds of millions of people who are suffering from mental health issues pre-COVID, and now with PTSD, especially when you talk about like the hospital workers and the essential workers. That's going to be a huge problem. And so you're seeing Starbucks, Chipotle, potentially your companies, Chase, all these companies investing in employee assistance programs, such as offering free online therapy and then potentially like on-site therapy in the future. So I think therapy and mental health and employee assistance programs, those investments will continue to grow because there'll be a huge aftermath and future crisis that we're going to experience post-pandemic.
I'm going to remind people you can still submit questions, and they're still coming in. We have a ton of them, and one of them actually dovetails really well into what I want to talk about. Honestly, my kids are teenagers and college age. They're going through their own things right now. They miss their friends. It's really hard to just be with us. I mean, I know I seem fun, but I'm not that fun. My heart goes out to people with young children. I am telling you, my colleagues who have young kids, I just want to give them a giant virtual hug because it's really, really, really challenging. So my question is, and this actually came from somebody, caregiving responsibilities, both of kids and older family members. So for the sandwich generation folks who are dealing with aging parents, it's been also equally hard because they can't even see them. How can you support family caregivers? What can we be doing to support caregivers of all different ages?
I'll weigh in a couple of things, and I'm sure Cheryl and Dan, you both have views on this. I'll use some personal experience. I was talking to my boomer mom last night, and we are personally in a position where we've not been able to see one of my grandparents who is in assisted living because she's in a state where they're not in any phase 3 or 4, but she has a progressive illness, and we are forbidden from seeing her for health reasons. It is her singular cause of stress every day because she's afraid she's going to get a call, and she's afraid that's going to be a bad call and that we won't be able to do anything. And there's been so many people who have been not able to be with their loved ones during their time of sickness or loss. The other thing is, so that requires a level of empathy. Like, we have to turn empathy highest, because even though I may not have small children, or even though you may not be in a position where you are caretaking for older family members, you have to understand that this is a matter of the heart. It's not just about work. It's not just about how we show up and be productive. You aren't going to be able to fully engage and do your very best if a part of your heart is literally stressed behind something different. I've had a couple of colleagues who their kids have run in the room or interrupted the conference call, and instead of everyone doing an awkward silence, I just let them be a parent because that is their first job. It is the most important job. It's not what we're doing, it's their ability. And I think that we have to get some of the awkwardness out of bringing life to work. If 2020 has taught us anything, is that we can stop the separation of once you get off the elevator, you have to put on the facade. There is no elevator. There's like my bedroom and there's like my living room, and that's it. And so at this point, I think it's really about the humanity of this. I think that we have to use the B word, which is boundaries. And it is not being used enough right now. We have got to allow our colleagues the space they need to care for themselves and others, and that is boundaries. Hi, other member of our panel. That's exactly what
I was going to say, right on cue. That is Kona, our rough collie. Those who've ever watched older shows like Lassie, he looks just like that.
Oh my gosh!
And,
I grew up with 4 of them.
Border collies?
Yes.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And so he just wanted to join the conversation.
Hi, Kona. Well, Cheryl, do you want to weigh in with that? I mean, I was leading with boundaries and empathy, but Kona has passed the mic. So do you share your thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say, in many ways, Emily, both you and Dan have touched on it. We've brought work home literally. Now, it's kind of an interesting phenomena, right? Because in the agrarian age, work and home were all in the same place. And then when we went to the industrial society, right, that's when we separated work and home. Well, now work has come back home. And so with work coming back home, you're in my dining room, right? You are in my home in ways that generally my colleagues have never been in my home, or vice versa. And so that it goes back to the earlier thing. It's both the empathy, understanding we in general are human, and stuff happens, and we need to do things, So we've tried, but we're still working on it. I think everybody's still working on it. We've provided like different resources for working parents, like literally kind of tips for children of different ages.
Share something.
Yes.
My next question was going to be, and this was one that came in across the transom. You can still ask your questions. How do you coach employees on getting work done with all the distractions at home? So if you just have, what are your best practices, just super fast?
Yeah. Certainly it's about trying to establish a schedule. And we know that's difficult, but even with younger children, if they understand that, at this time we're going to sit and we're going to color and we're going to paste, then you block it out on your calendar. I'm sorry, I'm going to be coloring and pasting and running around the backyard with Kona, right? So you schedule in the time to actually take care of. And when it intrudes, I think everybody's understanding. And everybody goes, oh, I get it. Don't worry about it. We can reschedule. I am blessed in that my father is living with us right now, but he's got lots of underlying conditions. And so whenever I have to take him to the doctor or do something, I broadcast it. Hey, I'm going to be out of pocket. And people are like, oh, okay, great. Hope he's okay, and then we move on and get things rescheduled.
I think give people video optionality too. I mean, there might be a new mom who needs to nurse, but she can do that and be on the call. She just can't be on the video while you're doing that. She doesn't want to. So give people that optionality for those early morning or late night or weird time. Just give that, because I think it allows people to still go about some functionality if they are parenting or have different things they have to do. I also think the calendar blocks is great. I also think just an intentional conversation with your manager or your team, just so they kind of know, not all the details if you don't want to share them, but enough to where everyone can be on the team and work together and give each other grace. I think grace is another huge word that we need to use. Boundaries, grace, just know and trust that we're going to get the work done, but let's have some fluidity in what that looks like. And parents and caretakers, tell us what you need. Just straight up, be honest about it, and let's get that out of the way.
Well, what we're really talking about, just to close this out, is communication.
Yeah.
The better the communication, the more you're communicating, the better the relationships will be, and the more people will trust you and feel confident that they're allowed to, teach their kids something for the next hour, for instance. So, and we all kind of work different. And I think that this has been a big awakening for us. So we need to be empathetic, because, you could be a morning person, you could be a night person, you could have kids that are 2 years old, 12 years old. It's all over the place. Like I was saying before, we all have different experiences. And therefore, the more we communicate, the more we can relate to each other and empathize with the situation, the better. And everyone wants to just be themselves, by the way. People don't want to be like work Jane and personal Jane. They just want to be Jane. Right? Or Mike. And the more we can welcome a full person in terms of all their interests aside from work, the better off we're going to be.
Okay, another question, and I hope you all heard that my doorbell rang. That was really great while I was sitting there. When it comes to, and such a nice doorbell too, when it comes to your organization's policies and procedures, to what extent do you specifically look at age as a dimension of diversity and inclusion? We heard in Joanne's welcoming remarks, it's surprising how many people don't include age as part of their diversity policy. So who wants to take that one? Cheryl, I'll put you on the spot because you've been doing it longer.
Sure. I was just trying to quiet Kona from additional contributions. Certainly, when we think about diversity and we think about it broadly, we regularly talk about geography, generation, gender, and ethnicity, as well as, of course, abilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it is an integral part of how we think about diversity. So we have specific programming around like our early in career program designed to give kind of visibility and experiential learning to those earlier in their career so that they can continue to progress and develop. But we try to do that for all generations. So that's one of the reasons why we are part of the Longevity Project, which is looking at older, more seasoned workers and how do you, throughout anyone's career, make sure they have opportunities to learn and grow. That's what we focused on. And the Longevity Project is one in which it talks about the need and the value of having an all-generation workforce. And we're excited about the work.
So look into your crystal balls, my experts, and I want each of you to talk about this, but don't repeat each other. How do you envision what the office is going to look like when this is all over?
I think based on all my research and all my conversations, it's a hybrid model. I think about different people's needs. So we've talked about age, we talked about generation, gender, ethnic background. There's also life stage too, right? So, if you're younger, but, maybe if you're older, you're having a kid, sooner rather than later, that impacts how you work and how you live your life. So I think that there's so many layers on top of this that organizations are going to have to be smarter about who they hire, where they hire, who works in an office, who doesn't work in an office. Like I talked to the head of HR at Sodexo, and what she said is she has like team A and team B, and then they switch off, meaning that, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be you're working remote full time. It could be maybe once things get normal, people working 2 or 3 days in the office and 2 or 3 days at home. So there's no one size fits all model. And there's also like, what's the profession and the nature of the job? Are you a doctor? Are you an essential worker? Are you, doing marketing or communication programs? What industry are you in? So there's so many different variables. So I think it's going to be different, but I think it's a phased approach for getting back to work and a hybrid model overall.
Emily, what's your crystal ball say?
Gosh, my crystal ball is not as informed as Dan's. I think that in 5 years, the workforce demographics are going to change tremendously as generation millennial takes over in terms of leadership or more leadership positions, and Gen Z emerges. I think it's going to shift the office cultures a lot. I think that we will probably see some companies double down on more space, like Cheryl said, so that people can convene and have, or Dan said that they can convene because they want to be together. But I think we are going to find some companies eradicate their highest top line cost, which is real estate. And I think that when people are looking at the economic realities of COVID-19 and the financial hat I put on, the markets are not going to recover for some time across industries and geographies. And I think when companies have to look at bottom line, they're also looking at employee costs and looking at real estate. That's their two biggest line items. They're going to start slashing real estate. And that creates smaller spaces, maybe not in every office they had them before. I think the idea of a company headquarters might go away. I do think there's going to be some reimagining of all of that. And I think it's going to demand more democratization of the workspace and more imagining of what culture and being in the office really looks like. I think we're going to be more here than we are what we were in the past.
Cheryl, what's your crystal ball say fast? Because I want to get to one more question.
Okie dokie. It's a combination of both what Dan and Emily said. We're absolutely taking a phased approach. We absolutely had already had a hybrid model. And so we are anticipating that there will be more options for flexibility. And again, it's the kind of matching what needs to be done with where you are to do it. So if I need perhaps more solitude and to write, to imagine, etc., then maybe I'm at home. If I need that energy and collaboration from being with different people, then perhaps I am in an office. But we think it'll vary.
One other question, because we've gotten a bunch about morale, and companies are cutting costs. There's Zoom fatigue, which kind of plays into morale too. So I'm putting them together. But how can leaders manage morale remotely? Like, how can we make people feel better given everything that's going on in the world? Any advice?
Yeah, I go back to communication again. People feel better. So if you think about the top leaders in terms of politicians and, Fauci and everyone that have gotten a high favorability ratings, it's because they were visible. Part of building trust, which I think is the underlying word that connects almost everything that's been said in this call, is how do we build trust, is being visible, being out there. And from a corporation to, if you're chief diversity officer, head of HR, CEO, the more you're communicating, giving people updates, being honest and transparent, the more you'll instill trust. And trust in strong relationships will yield high returns in terms of retention. So people will stay with you longer and work harder for you, and that boosts morale.
Anyone else want to add?
I think every day is a winding road. I think you can have a morale boost one day, but then what happens when we are uninspired by what's happening outside of work? I think that's a matter of bringing your whole self to work. There are going to be some moments where you're good on this conference call and then you're turning on your news and you're not. And I think that we just have to be honest about where people are and meet them there. I think we can't force morale. I think we have to know that this is an uncertain and weird time for us as human beings. But I do think we can remain positive about our relationship and intent with one another to be in it together. I've found that the more leaders talk about we're in this together, we'll get through this together, and they're visible like Dan, it humanizes people. It makes you feel like morale is not something you're trying to manufacture. And I just think that humanity and that empathy goes a long way. So I think that will help.
And I would just add authenticity. People are willing to go through hard things if you're honest with them about saying, we know this is hard. And again, as Emily said, but we're in it together. And here's how we can get through it. And when leaders role model that they too have challenges, that they too are honestly having to think about and dig deep, people respond to that. And that helps support everyone's morale.
And invite them to come along on the journey with you. Let them not just be the people you talk down to. Allow them to stand on the same side with you and you all map it together. Get rid of the hierarchy and the morale, because I think that's important too.
And that's really important because it's not like we've been through a pandemic before, so everyone's learning. And I think the more you're open to ideas, because you're not thinking of everything as the CEO or the chief diversity officer, but if you incorporate people's ideas, diversity of thought, you're more likely to come up with solutions that are going to benefit the greater population.
Which goes right back to communication and really staying in touch so that you can hear the input and understand what's being said before you act, so that we all own the action.
So my last question, and this is something I've been asking all along, I've been moderating a series of Twitter chats too, around all issues, including race, remote work, healthcare. But the last question that I always ask my experts is the same. What gives you hope?
I'm going to say younger generations. I'll say younger generations because I think that, with all this technology, with their upbringing, especially Gen Z now, they're activists. They want change. They're pressuring companies to make better decisions that maybe they should have made years ago. So I think putting pressure on institutions to change is being driven, especially by younger generations, and that's a positive thing because I think we're due for a change. And I think the pandemic has forced the pandemic and everything that surrounded the pandemic with, social unrest, et cetera, has forced this change that should have happened years ago. And it's being driven by everyone, but a lot by the younger generations. And that gives me hope.
Emily or Cheryl?
I'll say what gives me hope is similar to Dan, just making good trouble. John Lewis inspired me with that op-ed that he posted in the New York Times before he passed away, or after he passed away, it published. I mean, he was 80 years old making good trouble. And if we, and that's a generation that's not represented here, right? The greatest one that we talked about and all the work that they've done. If people are not happy or satisfied with the life we have in society or in the workplace, let's change it. Let's make some good trouble. And that gives me hope because I see people becoming fed up and they're making changes. And I love the good trouble that we're all willing to get ourselves in and be accomplices of change. So,
Cheryl, I want to give you quickly the last word. We're at 3:00.
Our humanity gives me hope. So when we see each other fully and wholly as human, the way we speak to one another, the way we treat one another, the way we work together and value one another totally changes. And that's what gives me hope.
I value all of your insights and
Thank you.
your expertise. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank you for having this conversation. It's not over, obviously. We want to keep having it. But for now, thank you for joining us. And we'll be back soon with more insightful conversation from Reuters. And see you then.
Thanks, Lauren. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And Kona said if you want to send a dog treat, he wouldn't turn it down.
I have a whole closet. I sent my dog to doggy daycare.
Good to see you. Thank you.